Beyond the curved cockpit glass, the planet appeared as a blue-gray sphere shrouded in mist. Thick bands of cloud, drifting slowly over dark continents. KL tightened his harness one more notch, the metal buckle clicking dryly beside his ear. "Surface conditions look good?" he asked, eyes never leaving the terrain display. The pilot snorted softly, his fingers gliding over touch controls. "Strong low-level winds, electrical storms over the restricted zone. We're touching down on the edge, KL," he replied. KL nodded and didn't argue. His job was to gather biological samples, not to pick picturesque landing sites. The survey craft shuddered as it slid into the atmosphere, the canopy fogging from friction before erupting in a halo of re-entry fire. The cabin lights flickered and shifted to dim red. "We're fine," the pilot muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The craft plunged into cloud as thick as mud, and suddenly everything outside was a solid wall of gray. That was when the interference started crawling across the screens. Black and white streaks danced on the radar like a swarm of invisible insects, gathering and scattering with no pattern KL recognized. "There's something in the air," he whispered. The pilot cursed, trying to retune the frequency, but the more he adjusted, the louder the static grew, like someone scraping their nails along the inside of a skull. The warning strip along the ceiling lit up all at once, a row of red flashes blinking like the eyes of something that had just woken. "We're losing pitch control," the pilot shouted. The nose dipped, artificial gravity went wild, and KL felt his stomach lift out of his body. "Pull up!" he shouted on reflex, even though he knew the pilot was already doing exactly that. The interference on the screens suddenly thickened, overlapping into shapes that looked almost like a map of a swarm closing a ring. Then something slammed against the hull, making the metal ring as if a hailstorm were hammering directly on bone. Everything after that shattered into screams, white flashes, and the sensation of being hurled into weightless nothing. KL woke because of the cold. His chest flared with pain when he tried to inhale, as if someone had set a small boulder on his sternum. The cockpit now leaned hard to one side, the canopy crazed with spiderweb cracks. One section blown out to reveal a dull gray sky beyond. The pilot was no longer in his seat. The harness hung torn. A smear of dried blood streaked across the armrest and floor. "Anyone still alive?" KL called, his voice hoarse, swallowed by the hollow shell of the ship. No answer came, only the wind seeping through the fractures. He rummaged for the emergency pack, dragging out a med kit, a few ration bars, a water canister, and a bright orange distress beacon. The beacon was intact, its indicator blinking faintly like the eye of a wounded animal. He crawled to the breach in the canopy, kicked away the remaining shards to widen it, then set the beacon on the exposed hull. Outside lay a world drowned in mist. Strange trunks rose from the gray veil, their leaves like wet strips of hide glowing with a faint phosphorescent green. The ground was soft, sinking a little under his boots, breathing out a smell of rot mixed with burnt metal from the hull. KL flipped the beacon on, listening to the steady beeps as invisible radio waves shot into the thick gray sky. "This is KL, Survey Craft Lumen 3, downed on the surface. Anyone copy?" He tried over his comm. Only static answered, a long hiss that began to tremble into short, even pulses sounding almost like distorted whispering. He shut the comm off, unsure if it was just interference or something listening back. The sun, if there was one, was swallowed by the dense mist, turning day into a perpetual twilight. KL decided to gather what he could carry and retreat back into the wreck, where at least there were metal walls to lean against. He dragged a fallen panel across the breach as a makeshift barricade, leaving a narrow slit to watch through. Night, or whatever passed for night on this world, came very quickly. Outside, new sounds rose, the metallic rasp of insect wings and something larger sliding through the mist, dragging a breeze along with it. KL sat with his back against the hull, hastily bandaging a few cuts and chewing a ration bar that felt like rock. The smell of smoldering wiring, hot plastic, and unfamiliar soil mixed into a headache. Somewhere beneath the insect chorus, he heard that same sound from earlier. Static, very soft, like someone whispering through it. The beacon sat just above him outside the breach, blinking steadily, and every time it flashed, the static seemed to shift its rhythm. "That's not possible," he muttered, but in his ears, the static was starting to arrange itself into segments like a beat. He closed his eyes, trying to write it off as his ears and brain playing tricks after the crash, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Something out there was beating back. His first night on the unknown world passed in a half-sleep, half-vigil, and in Kyle mind a question took root before it found words. If something was listening, was it still anything like people at all? When Kyle woke, the light outside was barely brighter than when he drifted off. Everything in his body complained. Shoulders like stone, his back aching, his neck stiff, his head leaden. The beacon's beeping above him was still steady, stubborn as an artificial heartbeat. Kyle wriggled past the panel and poked his head outside to look. The mist was still thick, but he could see better now. Tall, smooth trunks with no lower branches, their crowns spreading strips of hide-like leaves far overhead. Tiny droplets pattered down from above, collecting in the thick lichen carpet underfoot like a giant sponge. "At least it's not a desert," he muttered.
I think I heard something
Kyle
moving out there.
checked the beacon again.
Do you copy?
The light was still blinking, power still at half. There had been no reply all night. "Fine. We do this the hard way," he said to himself, then slid down off the hull. The first rule in any crash on unknown ground he recalled from training. Count. He recited silently. Water, shelter, signal, fallback. Water was the only thing he didn't have yet. Kyle slung on his pack, clipped his multi-tool knife to his hip,
I don't know how much
then
longer
picked a
I can keep this
direction
up.
into the forest,
The heat is
marking
unbearable.
his path with cuts on the hull and nearby trunks. The deeper he went, the thicker the mist became, eager to swallow his outline in just a few steps. But the sounds grew clearer. The drip of water, something like a very small stream, hidden in the crackle of insect clicks. He followed the sound, pushing aside thick lichen and drooping leaf strips to reveal a shallow stone channel where clear water ran in thin strands. It was so thin a flow that a careless step would break it, yet it kept running, stubbornly, as if trying to escape this ground. Kyle pulled out a pocket filter, filled his canteen, shook it, and sniffed. No harsh chemical scent, just damp rock and something faintly metallic. He sipped, held it in his mouth, then swallowed. The strange, cold water slid down his throat, leaving a taste like biting a coin. Good enough for now, he decided. As he straightened, he noticed that the nearby trunk bore parallel cuts, evenly spaced, etched deep into its smooth bark. They didn't look like claw marks or bite traces, but rather like someone had used a sharp tool, striking in a deliberate rhythm. Kyle looked around. No human footprints, no tire tracks, nothing familiar. Only patches where the lichen was pressed down, as if something light had walked across it on feet that weren't quite human. He headed back to the wreck, the sense of being watched clinging to him like a shadow. The second item on the list. Food. Rations wouldn't last long. He needed something he could source here. He cut lengths of strap from a seat, bent a small metal rod into a bow shape, and fashioned two simple snares. He set one near the forest's edge, where tiny creatures hopped between lichen mounds. The second he placed near the water channel, where he'd seen faint movements in the mist. Not looking for
Just a little tighter.
anything big,
Need this to work.
he told himself.
Come on.
Just enough for a meal. The rest of the day passed in small tasks, shoring up his shelter with panels, collecting any useful scrap, checking his medkit again. Every time he paused, he glanced toward the tree line. Every time, he saw only fog. As the mist thickened again, signaling this world's version of dusk, Kyle decided to check his snares. The snare by the water was empty, the cord intact, the bait untouched, only a few small scratches scored into the soil around it. The snare at the forest's edge was the opposite. The line had tightened, but there was no animal inside. The loop had been neatly unhooked from the branch and retied with a better knot, as if someone had seen his sloppy work and fixed it for him. The bait, a broken piece of ration bar, was gone. In its place at the base of the snare lay something else, a round, soft-skinned object oozing clear liquid. Kyle picked it up. The fruit-like thing was cold, shrinking slightly in his hand as if reflexively. He scored it with his knife. Inside was clear, faintly glowing flesh, smelling like clean rain. He dabbed a droplet onto his tongue.
The forest is
Cold,
too quiet.
mildly sweet.
We need
No
to get clear of the
bitterness or
snare before it
numbness.
activates.
Someone traded the bait for something better, he whispered. That second night he sat inside the wreck longer, eyes glued to the narrow gap between two panels. Outside, the fog moved like something alive, gathering and dispersing between the trunks. Sometimes he thought he saw a small shape, not quite shoulder high on a person, standing at the edge of the fog, vanishing when he blinked. Kyle couldn't tell if it was a creature or just another trick of a concussed brain. When he finally dozed off, it was from exhaustion, not from any sense of safety. The next morning, when he stepped outside, he saw two more of those fruits laid neatly beneath the beacon. There were no clear footprints leading to them, only patches where the lichen had sunk and then rebounded, like water disturbed and stilled again.
Scan the
So
perimeter.
that's certain, he said softly. I'm not alone here. A moment later, he added a new item to the mental checklist, right alongside water and food. Find out who the neighbors are. On the third night, Kyle decided he was done waiting passively. All that day, he barely left the wreck, taking only a short loop around the tree line to half-heartedly check snares and the water source. Most of his time he spent watching the new gifts that appeared and vanished at his doorstep. The first fruit he'd tasted hadn't killed him. The second he'd cut into pieces and dried, watched for reaction. By the third, he left it intact on the hull and placed a ration bar beside it. Trade, he whispered. Let's see if you understand that. As the fog thickened, Kyle retreated inside, dragging the panel back into place, leaving only a narrower slit, just wide enough for one eye. He killed the lights, leaving only the faintest glow from a small device, just enough to keep from tripping if he had to stand. The comm unit lay silent by his side, but he didn't wear it. Tonight, he wanted to listen with his own ears. Outside, the fog deepened into a solid gray, thinning only when a breeze swept through. Kyle didn't know how long he sat there. Time stretched in the dark like a rubber band being pulled and pulled. Then he saw it. A small shadow froze beside the beacon, just a little taller than the hull. It moved strangely, making almost no sound, as if its weight had been divided into many tiny parts and spread out. In the beacon's blinking light, Kyle saw that its skin wasn't really skin, but something between fine scales and wet hide, reflecting light like damp stone. Its eyes were larger than a human's, bright like 2 drops of water catching the light, but not the hollow stare of a predator. It bent down, taking the ration bar in long, slender fingers, thin webs of skin connecting the joints. Kyle held his breath, afraid that any movement would snap this fragile thread. The small creature brought the bar to its nose, inhaled deeply, then gently set it back where it had been. In return, it took a larger, more translucent fruit from a strap at its side and placed it by the beacon the way someone might set an offering on a shrine. You really do understand, Kyle thought, his heart pounding. At that moment, the small creature turned its head and looked straight at the gap. Kyle didn't pull back in time. Their gazes met through the metal. In those eyes, he saw clearly not the gaze of a wild animal, but of a child suddenly catching sight of a stranger. "Hey!" Kyle blurted, forgetting they shared no language. The little creature jolted, sprang back a step, its foot slipping on the dew-slick hull. It nearly slid off the hull, but a long, strong arm shot out of the fog and grabbed its wrist. This time, Kyle caught only a glimpse of another body, taller, sturdier, the same fine-scaled skin, but darker, streaked with glowing lines down the arm like frozen lightning. The small creature, now clearly more child than beast, whispered something, its voice crackling like water dripping onto hot stone. The other, arm, belonging, he had no trouble guessing, to a warrior, turned its head to look toward the slit where he hid. Kyle instinctively jerked back, but too late. The taller shadow dropped off the hull, landing low, vanishing from his line of sight. He spun, reaching for his multi-tool, when the panel beside him jolted violently. A blade, not metal, but a spearhead of black bone, thrust through the gap, hooked the panel's edge, and yanked hard. The panel popped free, opening a hole wide enough for a body to slip through. Kyle snatched up his knife just as the tall, lean figure stepped through the pouring fog and straightened inside the tilted cockpit. It was the first time he saw one of their kind clearly, nearly half a head taller than him, body taut and athletic, dark, fine-scaled skin crisscrossed by glowing lines along the neck and arms like living patterns. Her eyes, he guessed, held none of the curiosity from the smaller one's gaze, but the watchful weight of a guard. Cautious, calculating, ready. "Wait," Kyle said, raising both hands. The knife still pinched between two fingers, as if even he wasn't sure whether he was surrendering or holding the line. The warrior said something, her voice deeper, steadier, like stones rolling along a stream bed. From outside, the smaller creature peeked in, clearly much younger, eyes wide, looking at Kyle with a mix of fear and fascination. "It's you," Kyle blurted, knowing it wouldn't understand. He let the knife fall to the floor, trying to look as unthreatening as possible. Both creatures tracked the knife with their eyes, then looked back at him. The warrior, later he would know her as Niara, took one step forward and touched the spear tip lightly to his chest, as if testing his reactions. He stood still, hands still up, feeling the tip cold as stone, stopping exactly over his heart. Niara searched his eyes, then abruptly stepped back, turned the spear, and kicked the knife aside with one precise motion. She spoke a few quick words to the smaller one, indicating KL and then the outside. Before KL could make sense of it, something cold and flexible wrapped around his wrists. He glanced down. It was a root-like cord that tightened on its own like a living thing, glowing dimly. "Good," he rasped, half to them, half to himself. "At least you haven't killed me." Niara gestured for him to move, the spear tip brushing his back as a reminder. They led him away from the wreck and into the heavy fog. The world shrank to a few steps ahead and the sound of 3 sets of footsteps on the soft ground. Every time he stumbled, Niara grabbed his arm and hauled him up. Not gently, but not trying to hurt him either. Alive, not for meat, Kyle thought, clinging to that flimsy logic for comfort. They walked long enough for his sense of direction to unravel. The beacon's distant beeping faded, leaving only the sound of water flowing somewhere ahead. The fog began to thin. The trunks opened up, revealing a wide depression where the ground sank into a bowl carpeted in moss. At the center of the bowl, water collected into a small pool, its glassy surface reflecting bluish halos from structures growing around the shore. The structures looked half like houses, half like giant fungi, trunks of interwoven organic bones supporting layered, translucent hide-like roofs. And there, under the weight of all the eyes turning toward them, Kyle realized he had just stepped into the territory of a tribe that didn't exist on any human map. On the far bank of the pool, an older Sha'ari stood apart from the others, tall and thin, the light from the patterns on his skin softer but far more intricate. His eyes, not as bright as the youngsters, but deep and still, locked onto Kyle's, as if reading through each layer of his thoughts. Niara halted, her hand pressing down on his shoulder, forcing him to kneel on the damp moss. Kyle lifted his face to meet the elder's gaze through the faint mist rising from the pool, and for the first time since crashing on this world, he truly felt like the intruder. The elder raised his staff and tapped it on the ground 3 times, The sound echoed through the basin, low and hollow, like an old drum. Then he spoke, slowly, each syllable dropping like a stone into water. Kael. Hearing a non-human voice speak his name perfectly, Kael suddenly felt the mist around the pool thicken, swallowing whatever was left of the world beyond this basin. The elder's voice still echoed in Kael's head. Kael. He didn't have time to ask how the elder knew his name before Elder Shael. He guessed that was his name. Raised a hand, palm facing him. It was either a stop sign or a greeting. Kael wasn't sure, but he slowly raised his bound hands anyway, showing he held no weapon. Elder Shael spoke a string of low, drawn-out sounds, his eyes never leaving Kael. Kael understood none of the words, but he recognized a rhythm. A few short sounds, then a pause as if waiting for an answer. Kael, he said slowly, pointing to his chest. A few Shari murmured, their crackling voices like rain on dry bark. Elder Shael repeated, Kael once more, shorter, sharper, sealing it with a single tap of his staff on the ground. All right, Kael whispered. You know who I am. I still know nothing about you. He glanced at Niara. She still stood close behind him, spear angled, eyes fixed on Elder Shael. Tila was different. Half hidden behind a bone pillar, only those large eyes peeking out of the shadows, glued to Kael. Elder Shael lowered his staff to the water and stirred gently. The surface trembled, rings spreading outward, warping the reflections of the glowing structures into distorted halos. Shael pointed at the water, then upward, where the gray mist hid everything. He spoke a short sequence of sounds in which Kael heard two repeated, one before pointing at the water, one before pointing up. Water. Sky, Kael guessed, murmuring the sounds under his breath. A few nearby Sha'ari made crackling sounds that could only be laughter. Elder Shael did not laugh. He merely nodded slightly, as a teacher might when a pupil draws the first correct stroke. He tapped his staff on the ground again, this time closer to the water's edge, and spoke another word, his voice dropping lower. From the crowd, someone whispered along. A sound like Sha'rul, drawn out. Teeth clicking lightly together. A chill ran down Kael's spine even before he knew the meaning. The way they said it was enough to tell it wasn't a pleasant word. Elder Shael turned his staff and used the pointed end to draw in the wet soil by the pool. A circle, then small marks all around it like larvae encircling something. He pointed at the circle, then at the water, and again spoke the word Sha'rul. Kael swallowed. The swarm. Enemy. Something in the water, he guessed. Mind flashing back to the interference on the radar, the invisible insects closing in on the ship. Elder Shael watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like a blind man finding the right step in the dark. Niara spoke a few quick phrases to him, her voice sharper, like metal striking stone. Tila crept closer to Kael, squatting on the moss, copying him by placing a hand on its own chest, and whispering, Tila. Kael froze, then, without meaning to, smiled for the first time since he crashed. Tila, he repeated, nodding. For a strange, silent moment, they traded names with each other in the middle of a ring of villagers, still measuring him. The interrogation ended more quickly than Kael expected. Elder Shael signaled to Niara, then turned, walking along the shore with his staff, the other Sha'ari automatically parting before him. Niara grabbed the binding on Kael's wrists and pulled him to his feet.
I won't forget that.
Prisoner then, Kael thought. But at least I'm a prisoner with a name. They led him up the basin slope to one of the structures that looked like half a giant cocoon stuck to the hillside. Inside, a gentle blue light shone from fibrous strands clinging to the walls. No sharp angles, only curving lines like a softened stone cave. Nayara removed his bindings with a quick backward jerk, sending a tingle through his veins as blood returned freely. She said a short sentence, pointed to the floor, then outside. Her tone held less threat and more the weight of a rule.
They are wrong.
Kyle guessed. Stay here. Don't wander. He nodded, spreading his hands in a got it gesture, then sat on the floor that felt as soft as moss. Nyara watched him for one more beat, then turned away, letting the thin hide flap fall over the entrance, leaving Kyle alone with the blurred echoes of a village that did not belong to humankind. A little while later, the flap lifted again, and Tyla peeked in, carrying 2 translucent fruits and a handful of something that looked like roasted roots. It set everything down in front of Kyle, then backed up a little, like placing food in front of a newly tamed creature. "Thank you," Kyle said, knowing the word would pass through its ears like the wind. He broke off a piece of root and ate slowly. It was mildly sweet, slightly smoky, far kinder than the rock-hard rations. Tyla watched him chew, eyes wide, then copied him, biting into another piece as if confirming the food really was for both of them. They ate in silence, only the sound of chewing breaking through, while Kyle's heartbeat slowed, as if his body had finally accepted he wasn't being sacrificed.
It means a lot.
At least not yet. Night fell over the basin, light from the pool and the surrounding structures spilling through the doorway, turning the hut's ceiling into a shimmering water painting. Tila fell asleep before Kyle realized it, curled up like a child against the wall. Kyle gently pulled a woven mat of fibers from the corner and draped it over Tyla, unsure if it was meant as a blanket or part of the living furniture. Outside, somewhere on the opposite bank, Kyle heard Elder Shael's staff tapping rhythmically on the ground. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. The sound made him shiver, recalling the strange rhythmic interference that had beaten into his ears through the calm while the ship was falling. A tribe that speaks with rhythm and water, he thought. And somewhere out there, a swarm that hunts with rhythm too. He closed his eyes, listening to the lake, the staff, the strange hiss in his memory, and understood that from today on the question was no longer, how do I leave this planet? But which rhythm am I standing with? Kyle woke to a strange smoke scent creeping in through the hide flap at the doorway. It wasn't the burnt wiring and hot plastic he was used to, but something like roots burned with salt and water. Tila was gone. Where it had slept, there was only a faint patch of warmth and a slight depression in the soft floor. Kyle lifted the flap and peered outside. The whole village was moving to a different rhythm, urgent, quickened, but not chaotic. Adult Shari carried spears, bone bows, and dimly glowing cords wrapped around their wrists like living weapons. On the shore, Elder Shael stood still, eyes turned toward the forest rim where the mist was markedly thicker. Nyara appeared at the hut's entrance without knocking, simply pulling the flap aside. She spoke a short, sharp sentence, then motioned for Kyle to follow. "New rules already," Kyle muttered, but stepped out, fingers unconsciously rubbing the place where the cord had bound him. They didn't tie him this time, either a good sign or simply that they knew he had nowhere to run. By the water's edge, Tila stood with a few other young Shari, each holding a bundle of glowing fibers, as if awaiting orders. As Kyle came closer, Tyla rose slightly on its toes, greeting him by tapping a closed fist against its chest. Kyle copied the gesture, tapping his own chest. Tila, a warm moment flickered, then was cut short by Elder Shael's staff striking 3 beats on the ground. The sound bounced around the basin, reflected by the water, like a drum calling an assembly. Kyle watched Shari warriors fan out toward the basin's rim, where steep paths led up into the forest. Nyara spoke a few short phrases to Elder Shael, then turned to Kale, touching 2 fingers to her lips and pointing at the ground in front of him. "Quiet. Stay put," Kyle translated in his head. Elder Shael stepped forward, touching the tip of his staff lightly to Kyle's chest, then turning it to tap his forehead. "Kyle," he said, adding another word Kyle didn't know, but paired with a look that felt like both a warning and an offer. Elder Shael turned away, joining the line of warriors heading for the forest paths, leaving Kael at the lakeside with Tyla at his side like a small shadow. The village's atmosphere changed. Sha'ari, who weren't fighting, retreated into the hillside structures, pulling down hide flaps and leaving only narrow slits like eyes. Kael was nudged gently toward a jutting bone outcrop on the slope, a spot with a view of the forest yet partially concealed. Niara said something to Tila, her tone commanding but softer when directed at the youngster. Tila bobbed its head rapidly, then sat next to Kael, hugging the glowing fibers to its chest. "Looks like we're the unwilling audience today," Kael whispered. The forest above the basin was unnaturally quiet. No insect crackle, no drip from leaves, only the sound of fog sliding over trunks like cloth drawn over stone. Kael saw the Sha'ari, warriors lining the forest rim, their formation simple but tight. Some planted small bone stakes into the ground, linking them with glowing strands like a net. Elder Shael stood in the center of the line, staff planted in the moss, eyes closed as if listening to something beyond Kael's hearing. For a long time, no one spoke. It was as silent as when his ship had plunged through the cloud layer. Then it began. At first it was only a few black flecks, like ash, falling from above into the mist. The more he looked, the more he saw they weren't falling straight. They drifted along arcs, curling together into thin black whorls. "Sharul," a warrior murmured somewhere, the word rippling out like a cold wave. Kael remembered the circle and ticks Shael had drawn in the mud, remembered the interference swarming around the ship icon on the radar. The black ash gathered into heavier clusters, hanging between trunks, shifting shape without any wind. Suddenly, a four-legged beast burst from the fog, a cross between a deer and a lizard, eyes wild. On its back, Kael saw a clump of ash clinging tight, seeping between its scaled hide, making the flesh twitch. A warrior drew a bone bow. The arrow snapped out and buried itself in the creature's neck. The beast crashed down, but the ash didn't fall with it. It burst apart, splitting into smaller clumps that flew back into the forest like a retreating force. Kael's stomach clenched. Not a simple parasite, he thought. They test a shell, then abandon it when it's no use. Elder Shael's staff struck 3 beats on the ground, then 3 more, faster now. Immediately, warriors flung glowing cords from their wrists to the ground. The lines clung to moss and rock, stretching into an invisible screen. The ash clusters surged forward, hit the cord net, and for an instant Kael saw they weren't dust at all. They were countless tiny units, each like a shard of insect with a pinprick red eye. The cords flared bright, burning a portion of the swarm into gray smoke, but the rest immediately dipped low, slithering along the ground to find gaps. Tila clutched the bundle of fibers tighter, small body curling closer to Kael, the patterns on its skin flickering rapidly with fear. "Don't look," Kael meant to say, but Tila was already watching, wide eyes reflecting the swarm crawling along the basin's rim like spilled ink. Kael heard the pattern, not staff, not heart, but the vibration of the swarm itself, rising and falling in cycles like an invisible song. 3 quick pulses, a gap, 2 longer ones, repeating. They're talking, he realized. To each other. To something. On the front line, a warrior had the swarm spill over his leg. Within seconds, the scales there turned ashy gray, hardening like dead bark. A comrade rushed in, whipping his own glowing cord against the infected area, burning both scales and swarm away. The smell of charred flesh and some strange, metallic tang drifted down into the basin, making Kael's stomach revolt. At last, after so long that Kael felt the swarm's rhythm had seeped into his bones, Elder Shael's staff changed tempo. 2 long strikes, 1 short. The warriors began to withdraw, not in chaos but in distinct steps, falling back while cords and spears kept the swarm from spilling down into the basin. The swarm didn't spill downward. It seemed to snag on some invisible boundary, circling the forest edge before slowly melting back between the trunks. A few nearby trunks had changed color, bark gone gray and hollow as if all sap had been sucked out. When the swarm's noise finally died, leaving only the pool's murmur and the warrior's heavy breathing, Kael realized he'd been holding his own breath too. They brought down a badly wounded warrior into the basin. The upper half of his body was still normal. The lower half had turned into gray husk that rang hollow when they laid him down. Elder Shale knelt beside him, laid a hand on his brow and spoke a short phrase. Another warrior, without a word, lifted his glowing cord and brought it down hard on the gray husk. Kael turned his face away, but the sound hooked into his ears like barbs. When things finally calmed, Niara returned, armor speckled with black dust and streaks of drying blood. Tyla sprang up, rushing to wrap its arms around her leg, releasing a string of sounds halfway between a question and a sob. Niara rubbed Tila's head lightly, spear still firm in her other hand. Then she turned to Kael, and for the first time he saw not only caution in her eyes, but a kind of question. Elder Shael stepped forward, leaning on his staff, sizing Kael up from foot to head as if weighing him all over again. He drew quickly on the ground with his staff, a small circle, then surrounding ticks, the swarm sign. Beside it he added another, a long curve with a small dot piercing through it, like an orbit line in a ship. Shael tapped the orbit ship symbol, then touched the staff to Kael's chest. Then he tapped the swarm mark, and this time brought the staff up to touch Kael's forehead. "You want to know what I know about them?" Kael said slowly, aware that words wouldn't reach them, only eyes and gestures would. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the pool, watching the rings spread. "Ship falls," he said, pointing at the ripples, then up at the sky. He drummed 2 fingers on the ground in the swarm's pattern from earlier. 3 quick taps. A pause. 2 longer ones. "Before the crash," he said, pointing to his ear, then repeating the beat. Tyla watched him like he was telling a ghost story, while Niara turned to Elder Shale and spoke softly, her voice grave. Elder Shale was silent for a long time. Then he struck his staff once and said a single word, staring straight into Kael's eyes. "Sharul." Somehow, without translation, Kael understood. To them, the swarm wasn't just a species, it was a proper name. Elder Shale tapped the staff again, this time softly, in a different rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, then pointed at Kael. Kael understood it as an invitation, or rather a decision. Next time Shah Rul's rhythm echoed at the forest's edge, he wouldn't just be a spectator hiding behind stone. Chapter 6. When 2 rhythms match. After the battle, the basin sank into a silence unlike last night's. Not the quiet of waiting, but of those who had just survived. Kael helped carry bundles of fibers, bone tubes, doing small tasks even an outsider could handle. No one drove him away. No one smiled either, but the eyes fixed on him had grown less sharp than spear points. As this planet's sun, or whatever light source lay beyond the fog, tilted toward evening, Elder Shale beckoned Kael with a nod. Tyla had been chattering with other youngsters, but when it saw Kael following Elder Shale, it hurried over and latched onto his hem. Niara walked behind them, spear in hand, not as taut as in battle, but still ready. Elder Shale led them to a low cave opening behind a cluster of dwellings, where moss grew thick and light from the pool barely trickled in. Another secret, Kael thought, ducking inside. The cave wasn't deep, but the sound inside was utterly different. Every noise echoed twice, as if 2 sets of ears were listening. In the center lay a small pool, its surface taut as glass, reflecting the luminous patterns on Elder Shale's skin. Niara took position at the entrance, a living bolt in the doorway. Elder Shale sat by the pool, staff laid across his knees, gesturing for Kael to sit opposite. Tyla, predictably, chose a spot close to Kael, its head almost bumping his elbow. Elder Shale dipped his staff tip into the pool, then tapped lightly on the surface. 1, 2, 3. The beacon's beeping in Kael's memory rose up, and he unconsciously counted along with the staff's rhythm. Elder Shale spoke a single word, slowly, then added another tap on the water. Kael responded with his language instinct, repeating the word, mimicking its cadence while tapping his fingers on his knee in the same count. Tyla immediately copied him but tweaked the pronunciation, stressing the last part. Water, Kael guessed, pointing at the pool and repeating the word once more. Elder Shale nodded, a fleeting smile touching the corner of his mouth, a facial expression Kael hadn't seen from him before. They continued like that, pointing, speaking, tapping, repeating. Niara's name, Tila's, Elder Shale's, then words for familiar things: stone, moss, spear, sky. Elder Shale pointed at Kael too, repeating Kael as if engraving it into the pool. When they moved on to harder concepts like swarm, Elder Shale paused longer. He didn't say Sharul. He drew a circle of water, using the staff tip to punch tiny holes around its edge. As the tiny water punctures ran together into a dim, dark smear at the pool's center, he whispered the name. A shiver ran down Kael's spine, though the cave itself wasn't cold. His turn, he decided. With 2 fingers, he drew his falling ship in the damp mud, the arc of its path, then the swarm encircling it. He told them with words and gestures, the jammed signal, the pounding in his ears, the radar screen buried under black specks. Tila seemed to swallow each image, while Niara, even at the entrance, inclined her head, eyes now holding not just caution, but calculation. When Kael tapped out Sharul's rhythm on the cave floor, Elder Shale raised a hand to stop him mid-sequence, eyes suddenly sharp as a spear. Don't call it here, he understood without needing words. Instead, Elder Shale changed the beat. 1, pause. 1, pause. Steady and slow, like a resting heartbeat. He touched the staff tip to his own chest, then to Kael's, then to the cave wall. Our rhythm, Kael murmured, translating for him in his head. That night, when they left the cave, the world had shifted into the planet's bluish night, light from the pool washing waves over the stone walls. Elder Shale said nothing more, just nodded to Niara, then slowly made his way toward the higher dwellings where elders and children gathered. Niara stopped Kael with a light touch on his arm, then pointed down toward the basin floor. Down below, a few warriors were raising tall bone columns, fastening drooping luminous fibers that hung down to the water like roots. Niara spoke a word, slow and clear, then repeated it, tracing a circle around the lake with her hand. Shield. Kael repeated it, his accent skewed just enough to make Tyla giggle. Shield, he said again, correcting himself, then realized he was learning the name of what might save his life next time Sharul returned. As night deepened, Kael lay in the hut, eyes open, listening to Tila's curled-up breathing in the corner, the lake's pulse, and the unheard rhythm of the swarm somewhere in the woods. He tapped his fingertips on his chest. 1, pause, 1, pause, the rhythm Elder Shale had taught. Our rhythm, he repeated in his head, pitting it against the frantic beat of Sharul. For the first time since crashing on this world, Kael no longer wished to be rescued immediately. First, he wanted to understand this place's rhythm, so that when the 2 beats collided again, he wouldn't be standing at the edge anymore. The next morning, Kael stood once more on the ship's carcass, where everything had begun for him. Niara waited at the clearing's edge, spear planted in the ground, eyes locked on the forest rim. Tyla squatted by a tree root, doodling the ship in circles for the swarm into the dirt. Kael powered up a few of the ship's subsystems, the ones that hadn't completely fried during the crash. Indicator lights flickered, the main display showing only a smear of green-gray static, but the frequency receiver still breathed weakly. He took off his personal comm unit and wired it into the console with a makeshift cable braided from salvaged wires. "If I can hear you," he muttered, "then you can hear me." In his headset, the familiar hiss poured in. But unlike when the ship had been falling, he now knew how to pick out the rhythms. He picked out Shah Rul's beat. 3 short, pause, 2 long, buried deep in the static like a bad memory that refused to leave. But beneath it lay another rhythm, steadier, warped by distance. 1, 1, 2, repeating. It wasn't the tribe's rhythm, and it wasn't the swarm's. It was human. Standard military ping, one he'd memorized during training he'd tried hard not to think about since the crash. The blurry display gradually resolved into a warped string of characters. Still legible enough. Orbital relay. Expedition KL7. Status request. KL felt as if someone had opened an old door in his head, letting in the white glare of his past. He remembered the cold briefing room, the metallic smell, the map of the star system, a red trace blinking around this planet's orbit. "Collective intellect parasite," the commanding officer had said, tapping the red line. "Hollow swarm. It exploits whatever hosts it finds below the surface. We don't hit it blindly," the man had gone on, lowering his voice. "We strike in its rhythm. We need someone who can listen and beat back. That's your job, KL." Now, in the half-burned wreck, he heard that rhythm again, not from the swarm, but from orbit, from the people who'd sent him. On the display, the next line stuttered into view. "Confirm presence of host species. Authorize surface cleansing." Host species. In their language, that might mean Shah Rul. Anything it touched. It might also mean the Sha'ari. Kael looked out through the cracked cockpit window. Niara seemed much smaller out there, still on watch, and Tila was trying to blow dust off its drawing of the ship. "That's your host species," Kael whispered to the screen. "But to me, they have names now." The headset vibrated lightly. A string of short beeps, confirmation request code, chimed, then fell silent. They were waiting for his rhythm in reply. With a few taps, he could confirm there were hosts down here, and somewhere above, a decision would be made, knowing nothing of Niara or Tyla or the water's rhythm in the cave. "KL7, report," an old voice barked in his memory, blending with the current static. Instead of answering, he flipped the send channel off, leaving only receive. Static flooded back in, along with Shah Rul's familiar pulse, as if the swarm too were eavesdropping on the conversation above. Then, within that noise, something stranger emerged. Not just rhythm, but structure. A repeated sound sequence, slow, trying to become a word. K-L. This time it wasn't the people in the sky calling him, but something within the swarm. "I'm talking to the parasite," Kael thought, and the idea knotted his stomach. The sound sequence rose again, clearer this time, a strange word paired with his name. Kai-El Vo-Rak. Kael closed his eyes and listened hard. It was no human tongue, but it was clearly trying to mimic his language's structure. "Vorak," he repeated softly, to see how the swarm would react. In his headset, the noise warped into a rapid tremor like shattered laughter. Then Shah Rul's beat pounded harder in response. "So you have a name," Kael whispered. "Vorak, the voice of the swarm." The screen shuddered as a new message appeared. "Strike window, 72 hours, and awaiting pattern lock from field asset." Field asset. In their eyes, he was just a drumstick placed in the right spot to call the swarm up where it was easy to hit. He looked back toward the basin, where the lake's blue light climbed the cliffs, where Tyla had once tapped its chest and said, "Tila," stamping itself as a real, singular life. "I'm not your asset anymore," Kael said, this time not to the screen, but to the space between the two frequencies. He opened a different transmit channel, matching neither the military band nor Shah Rul's beat. An empty slice of spectrum, silent as an undisturbed pond. Then he tapped. Elder Shale's rhythm. The cave's water beat. 1. Pause. 1. Pause. Broadcast straight into the sky. If you want a pattern lock, he thought, you can have mine. In his headset, Shah Rule's rhythm wobbled for a moment, as if nudged off its usual orbit. The fractured voice returned, slower now, as if recalibrating. Kai. Vorak. Here. High above, somewhere behind the gray clouds, the orbital system was also recording that rhythm, assuming it had just received the swarm's lock pattern. Kyle didn't know whether he'd just saved anyone, or thrown them all into a more dangerous game. He only knew one thing. From now on, he wasn't just listening to two opposing beats. He had just wedged his own third rhythm between them. And somewhere in the swarm, among billions of tiny insect shards, a mind had just learned to pronounce his name, and would not forget. Kyle returned to the basin when the sky had turned violet, the lake's blue glow mixing with the faint red beyond the fog. Tila saw him first. It abandoned its game of tossing pebbles into the lake and rushed to the foot of the slope, arms flailing. Tila, Kyle called, forcing a smile, though his heart felt like stone in his chest. It skidded to a stop, panting. Then its gaze latched onto the object at his hip. The small comm unit, casing blackened. Instinctively, Kyle covered it with his hand. Tila looked up at him, then at his hand, the patterns on its skin flickering in a slow pulse like a wordless question. Later, Kyle murmured, pointing down toward the lake. Go. Down in the basin, Nyara waited at the lakeshore, spear sunk into the mud, eyes sharp as freshly honed blades. Elder Shale stood behind her, slightly to one side, staff planted in the moss, an anchor for the entire scene. As Kael and Tyla approached, the other Sha'ari automatically spread out, leaving a strange open space between them and the water's edge. A trial, Kael thought, swallowing dryly. Elder Shale raised his staff and struck a single beat into the ground. Kael realized it was neither the swarm's pattern nor the cave's heartbeat. It was a beat of waiting for words. Elder Shale pointed the staff at Kael's chest, then flicked it toward the water where the blank sky reflected. He spoke a string of sounds in which Kael caught two familiar words, one for people above, one for Shah Rule. Nyara added a few short, sharp sounds, pointing up at the sky, then toward the forest rim where the swarm had once seethed. Finally, she pointed straight at Kael, then tapped two fingers to her own chest. Nyara. Kael understood. They were asking where he stood, between the sky, the swarm, and this tribe. He unhooked the comm from his hip and held it up for all to see. The lake's glow lit the burns and cracks, revealing glimpses of circuitry within like strange bone. Kael, he said, pointing to his chest. Then he pointed at the comm and added a single word in his own tongue. Order. They didn't understand the word, but they understood how he said it, as if speaking of something high, cold, unseen. Kael crouched and wiped away footprints in the damp mud with his heel, clearing a flat, round patch. He drew again. An orbital curve, a small dot cutting through it, the ship. Then he added multiple dots above, linking them with thin lines. The orbital system, the things invisible from this basin. He tapped two fingers in the military rhythm. 1, 1, 2. The pattern he'd heard from orbit that morning. People of Kael, he said, pointing at the dots above the drawn sky and drumming the rhythm again. A murmur rippled around him. Elder Shale raised his staff, sweeping the murmur away like mosquitoes. Kael drew on. Below the orbit line, he sketched the basin circle, the lake at its heart, small ticks for the Sha'ari homes. He touched the lower circle and said, Sha'ari. Then he dotted tiny black specks around the forest rim, the swarm. He beat out Sha Rule's rhythm, 3 short, pause, 2 long, but this time he drummed in the air, not touching the ground, as if afraid to really summon it. Kael, he said, placing his hand between the orbit, the swarm, and the basin drawing. He tapped the comm in the military beat. 1, 1, 2. Me, he said, pointing to himself, then to the comm, then tapping out Sha Rule's rhythm. Sent, to call it. This time the murmur wasn't halted at once. It broke like waves, hit the stone walls, and rolled back as low growls. Niara took a step forward, gripping her spear shaft so hard her knuckles ridged. She unleashed a torrent of words, of which Kael caught only a handful. Kael, Sha Rule, before, die. He didn't need full translation. He knew she was talking about those who died yesterday at the forest's edge. Tila instinctively stepped back half a pace, eyes flicking between Niara and Kael, its skin patterns flashing in chaotic specks. Elder Shale struck his staff 3 slow, deep beats, as if pounding the stone beneath their feet, and the uproar faded. He stepped closer, near enough that Kael could clearly smell damp moss and the Elder's strange skin scent. Elder Shale spoke slowly, each word paired with a gesture, pointing to the sky, to the comm, to Kael, then down into the lake. Kael pieced the fragments together in his head. People above use Kael to call Sha Rule into basin. At first, yes, he said in his own language, then repeated with the words he'd learned, pointing at the sky. People Kael, at the comm, sound staff, then tapping Sha Rule's rhythm. He saw a few warriors tighten the glowing cords around their wrists, and for a moment he braced himself to be bound again. But, he said, abruptly beating a different pattern on the comm. Elder Shale's rhythm. 1, pause. 1, pause. He pointed to his chest, then the lake, then back up. Kael did not beat Sha Rule's rhythm to sky. Kael beat Shari's rhythm. This time, the murmur had a different tone, less anger, more astonishment. Elder Shale stared into Kael's eyes so long he had to fight the urge to look away. At last, he struck 2 beats. 1, 1. The same pattern Kael had just played on the comm. Niara ground her teeth but said nothing more. She turned away, spear in hand, circling the basin like a predator still unwilling to believe the forest was safe. Tila did the opposite. It stepped closer and laid a small hand on Kael's arm, a wedge driven between 2 grinding rhythms. Elder Shale turned his staff and suddenly beat out a longer, more complex sequence, aimed toward the rock wall behind the lake. From the rock came a low, drawn-out boom, as if the entire ravine were saying, "I hear." Kael flinched. He'd never heard this sound in the basin. It was like a colossal drum buried under stone. Elder Shale pointed his staff at the cliff and spoke a word Kael had never heard, low and heavy, like the boom itself. Tila whispered it again, touching its chest, then opening its hand toward the rock. God below. Goosebumps rose along Kael's arms. God below. Swarm at the forest rim. People above. 3 forces all mapped in mud at his feet. Elder Shale tapped a short beat, then, something Kael had never seen. He rotated the staff and extended its head toward him, as one might pass a drumstick. Every Sha'ari around them froze, their skin patterns dimming all at once, a collective "oh" swallowed back. Kael understood the gesture without translation. Elder Shale was giving him the right to beat the basin's rhythm. If I take this, he thought, I'm no longer theirs up in orbit. He looked at Tila. It stared back, not understanding everything but nodding hard, as if his hesitation were the stupidest thing in the world. Kael extended both hands and accepted the staff's head. The staff was heavier than he'd expected, yet strangely familiar, as if it were a tool he'd been born knowing how to use. Elder Shale stepped back, gesturing toward the god below cliff, then placing a hand on his own chest and then on Kael's. He spoke 2 slow words. Kael recognized just one. Shah Rule, lying between the others like a scar in the sentence. Kael filled in the rest. When Shah Rule's rhythm returns, whose beat will speak for you? He tapped the staff's head lightly against the ground, once in the cave's heartbeat rhythm. Shari's rhythm, he answered, needing no translation. Somewhere above, orbital systems were logging the wrong pattern he'd sent and waiting. Somewhere in the forest, the swarm would curl again into black flecks, pounding rhythm to correct its own orbit. And here, at the basin's floor, between water, stone, and God below, Kael had just accepted a new role. Drummer for a tribe whose name he hadn't even known when he arrived. That night, the sky above the basin was no longer just a harmless gray veil of fog. Faint streaks of light, like strangled lightning, occasionally flared overhead and died without thunder. Kael snapped awake on the moss bed in the hut, his heart out of sync with the lake's rhythm outside. Tila remained curled in the corner, its skin pattern steady like a pile of embers breathing. But in Kael's ears, through skin and moss, he caught another sound. The distant human beep blended with Shahruul's thrum. He quietly pulled the comm from where it was hidden under the bedding and pressed the earpiece tight to his ear. The tiny screen flickered, displaying a dim line. Strike window, 48 hours. Pattern lock. Acquired. They had accepted his rhythm, the Shari rhythm, as the swarms. In orbit, things he'd never seen with his eyes would now be preparing to fire at that beat. In his ear, the static subtly shifted structure, as if someone or something were listening back. A sequence sounded, steadier this time. K. Vorak. Here. Sky. The swarm could hear the sky too. Vorak, Kael whispered, as if calling someone in a dark room. Listen, the sky beat is wrong. I changed it. The reply was not a word, but a tremor running through the hut floor, shaking moss from the walls. Vorak is angry, Kael thought. Or interested. He switched off the comm, stowed it, then gently pulled some moss over Tila so the tremors wouldn't chill it. The next morning he stood by the lake, staff in hand, feeling as if he held 2 opposing heartbeats inside one ribcage. Elder Shale and Nyara waited for him in the echo cave. Tyla was already perched by the pool, legs swinging over the damp stone. Today, it was not Elder Shale who played the opening beat. Kael lifted the staff and struck a single beat on the cave wall. The sound bounced back twice, then a third time, then melted into the water's murmur. He told them, using the words he'd learned mixed with his own, about the comm's message. Beat locked. Fire of Kael people. Coming. Elder Shale repeated one word in a low voice, pointing at the cliff, then the water. Fire. Big? Kael nodded, drawing a wide circle around the pool with the staff. Fire. We'll hit. All this circle. Nyara's hands balled into fists, claws scraping the soft stone. People Kael kill Shari? If I let them, Kael answered, this time not dodging. Elder Shale looked down into the pool, where all 4 of them, Kael, Nyara, Tila, and himself, warped on its surface. 3 beats, he said slowly in his tongue, then played 3 distinct rhythms on the staff. Shahruul's, the pool's, and the military beat Kael had shown. 3 beats striking the same floor. Kael drew a deep breath and laid out the plan he himself found insane. Use his rhythm to draw the swarm away from the basin just as the Sci-Fi struck the false beat. He drew a canyon at the forest's edge, towering walls like a trap. Shahruul comes here, he said, dotting black specks into that canyon. Sci-Fi aim at my beat. Bend beat. If wrong, Nyara cut in. Fire hit basin, not canyon. If I do nothing, Kael replied, fire hits here anyway, just to someone else's beat, not ours. Elder Shale set one hand on the staff and the other on Kael's shoulder, a gesture of agreement both reluctant and inevitable. Either way, Kael thought, I've lied to the ones above. Now I can only lie all the way through. The following days passed like one massive drum rehearsal the entire basin had to attend. The Shari stretched glowing cords from their wrists into stone and bone stakes, weaving a new network from the god below cliff to the forest rim. Kael, staff in hand, walked with Elder Shale, testing each section, listening to how the sound ran through rock and water. They discovered that beats from the god below wall could slide along the cords to the forest edge and snap back like lightning without light. Here, Kael said, pointing at the real canyon he'd drawn before, its gray walls rearing up. The swarm gets pulled here. Niara stood on an outcrop above, eyes narrowed as if measuring the size of an invisible prey. Pull too close, she said. It spills into basin. Pull too far. Sci-Fi doesn't reach. We don't pull, Kael replied. We lure. Tyler was given a task that seemed small, but was crucial. Memorize a new sequence, quick and twisty, to beat on the cords at the forest rim when Kael signaled. This is bait, Kael explained, playing the pattern on the staff, then making Tyler repeat. This beat sounds like tasty. Brain. Tila didn't grasp everything, but it understood the word Sharul tied to this pattern, and that its task wasn't a game. Each night, the sky above the basin glowed a little brighter, hummed a little deeper. In the comm, text lines updated. 36 hours, 24 hours, strike path calibrating. Once the distorted human channel broke through with a few words. KL7, good work. Maintain pattern. Good work, he echoed in his mind, looking down at the basin where Tyler practiced beats with other youngsters. When the comm showed 12 hours, Kael stopped turning it on. He knew that from here on, everything would be decided by sound, not text. When the sky turned a blinding gray-white, neither day nor night, Elder Shale beat the alarm pattern on the god below wall. The boom answering from inside the rock was not calm this time. It was hoarse, harsh, as if God below too had sensed the sky's rhythm. The forest rim darkened, not from lack of light, but as the swarm converged, thickening into a ring of ink. Kael stood at the canyon mouth, staff in hand, Niara on the rock above. Tyla and several younger Shari crouched behind bone outcrops, hands poised on the glowing cords. When I play the bait, don't let it come closer than that line, Kael said, pointing to a moss mark on the canyon floor. Niara nodded, raising her spear and signaling warriors on both canyon walls to be ready to whip their cords if the swarm crossed it. Tyla glanced at Kael, then mimicked the bait beat on its cord, soft, but exact. Above, the sky groaned a deep hum, then fractured into the cold beeps on a frequency Kael now refused to hear. He raised the staff, feeling as if he were lifting an invisible drum that ran straight from his hands to orbit. All right, he thought. 3 beats, sky, swarm, and mine. Then Kael struck his first beat on the stone for both the swarm and the sky to hear. Kael struck his first beat on the rock. The sound rolled into the ravine, bounced out, and carried deep into the forest like a drum summoning a pack. The swarm answered. From the tree line, black dust drew together into flowing streams, curling down trunks and spilling onto the ground like rivers running uphill. It comes, Niara murmured, without looking down, eyes fixed on the forest edge. Overhead, the sky's hum deepened as faint rings of light turned within the clouds, like an eye focusing. Strike window, Kael thought, not needing to see the comm to know the countdown was scraping bottom. He played the second beat, quicker and more intricate, the bait rhythm he'd drilled with Tyla for days. The swarm's reply shifted from formless roaring to a defined, eager pulse, like a hungry heart catching the scent of blood. Tila, Kael called softly. Tila met his gaze, nodded once, then played the bait rhythm on its glowing cord, softly, but enough to send it skittering through stone to the tree line. The swarm heard it. Streams of black dust veered, skipping other treetops to pour toward the ravine as if drawn by gravity. "It bites," Niara muttered, this time her tone holding not just worry, but a grudging respect. Up above, the cloud rings tightened into a focal point where blinding white gathered like the tip of a colossal spear. "Strike path calibrating," Kael heard his old instructor's voice in his head, as if the man were standing on the cliff right now. The swarm began to pour into the ravine. Kael stepped slowly backward, leading them, beating the bait pattern on the stone. Bait, bait, until the moss-marked line nearly touched his heels. "Enough!" Niara shouted, her voice bouncing between the walls. Tila stopped playing, fingers trembling, but the pattern it had sent still ran along the cord, echoing once more at the tree line. Kael raised the staff, ready to change the beat. At that moment, inside the swarm's roar, a familiar voice cracked through. "K-L. Vorak. Here. Beat." It was speaking to him, right here, without the comm. "K-L. Not beat. Sky. True," Vorak hissed within the vibration. It had figured it out. "Correct," Kael thought, and instead of denying it, he switched. Not to the military beat, nor the bait, but to the third. The caves. The Sha'aris. That beat ran along the ravine floor, up the walls, slid down the glowing cords, and slammed into the God Below cliff in the basin. God Below answered with a boom like nothing before. Not only rock, but the lake and the air in everyone's lungs vibrated with it. The swarm stumbled half a beat like a running creature tripping over someone else's heartbeat. "Listen," Kael thought, hammering the Shari beat into God Below, each strike amplified into a command driven straight into the swarm's body. Above, the orbital system read that beat as Sha'ruul's. Just as it had locked onto earlier, the spear of light began to descend. Kael felt Vorak trying to wrench his beat away, the swarm shifting tempo, scrambling to slip off the Skyfire's timing. "No," he snarled, not with his mouth, but with each hammering blow. He shifted again, not to bait or cave, but to a pattern only he knew, the rhythm of his own heart since the crash. 1, 2, pause, 1. A strange beat, belonging neither to those above nor to Sha'ruul, nor fully to the Sha'ari, yet God Below echoed it faithfully, like stone obeying its own fault line. The swarm couldn't adapt in time. When the beam finally punched through the clouds and stabbed down into the ravine's mouth, the swarm was still pinned there by Kael's rhythm. The light never reached the basin. Cliffs and the ravine's angle shredded it, swallowing the swarm where it had curled like a fistful of black ash. Niara dropped to one knee on the ledge, shielding her face from the glare, chest heaving. Tila was thrown backward, ears ringing, yet it clung to its glowing cord, gripping it like a branch in a flood. Kael dropped to one knee, staff still in hand, its head jammed into cracked rock as the burnt stench of swarm filled his nose. Overhead, the beam withdrew, leaving the sky mottled with dark patches where clouds had been burned ragged. The comm back in the hut, though switched off long ago, would be logging that last rhythm as target eliminated. KL-7, strike successful, asset lost. He imagined someone reading in orbit, eyes never seeing this basin. In the remnant swarm, trembling black ash tried to recohere, but God Below struck another beat on its own, without Kael. "Vorak," the fractured voice whispered one last time in the noise. "Remember, beat, Kael," then went out like a coal doused in water. Long after the ring in their ears faded, Niara slid down from her perch and stepped up to stand in front of Kael. She said nothing. She simply extended her hand. Kael looked at that hand, then down at the staff in his grip, its head still vibrating faintly with God Below's aftershock. He shifted the staff to his other hand and took Nyara's. "Sky KL of the ravine," she said, voice rough but no longer barbed. Tyla scrambled up and ran to cling to his leg, babbling a stream of words in which only one came through clearly. Back. Home. On the way back to the basin, Kael glanced up at the sky one last time. There were no rings left now, only tattered clouds, slowly knitting shut. They'll mark this sector as clean, he thought. Clean of the swarm. Clean of me. When the Shari group emerged at the basin's rim, the whole tribe was already waiting by the lake, its blue light carving their faces from water. Elder Shael stepped forward, asked nothing. He just raised his staff and struck God below once. A beat not quite the caves, not quite Kael's. It was a fourth rhythm, the rhythm of a place that had survived blows from both sky and swarm. Kael stepped beside Elder Shael, lifted his own staff, and answered with the cave's beat. Tila ran forward and with bare hands played the old bait pattern on the rock. This time not to call Shah rule, but for fun, to prove it remembered. The other Sha'ari joined in, beating on bone stakes, cords, rock, turning the basin into a colossal drum ensemble. Kael closed his eyes and listened. No more military code, no more Shah rule, pulse, only water, stone, God below, and his own heart folded together. They don't need a guard anymore, he thought. They need a drummer. Somewhere above, the name KL7 would slowly fade on a screen. But here, under the ravine, Kael rang out whenever someone played a new beat, like a note preserved in the shared drum song.